René Descartes is often seen as one of the most significant philosophers of the early Enlightenment. 17th century figure, most famous for his concept that I think, therefore I am. Descartes engaged in this experiment really in the wake of a Europe where church authority had been shattered by the Reformation and where there were wars of religion going on, society was being convulsed in a lot of ways. The question of certainty, where can I find that place to stand that is absolutely certain? And Descartes engages in this thought experiment where he decides he will doubt everything. And ultimately that drives him to the point that the only thing he cannot doubt is his own existence, because in doubting of his own existence, ironically, he affirms his own existence. Where he's significant, I think, for the story of the West is he's very typical of what's emerging in the 16th and 17th century of this focus upon my inner self-consciousness as being the one point of stability and continuity in a world of flux and chaos. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is an 18th century French philosopher, most famous for being based in Geneva, actually. There's a little statue of him in the city of Geneva. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is not only a great political theorist, but also is somebody who explores what does it mean to be a genuine human being. And Rousseau is really one of the guys who articulates most influentially the idea that it's society that messes us up. The idea of the noble savage lies at the heart of his anthropology, this idea that human beings are born fundamentally good and sound. And the problems that emerge, that the sins we exhibit, the envy, the rivalry, the jealousies that characterize human society, they're actually a result of society perverting us rather than any kind of inner darkness or inner malformation leading to that kind of behavior. And he's often seen as an early theorist of what will later become the Romantic movement in Europe, that placed a great stock in the power of nature as being educative, the power of nature as being a salubrious force in shaping who we are as human beings, as opposed to the rising urban culture of the 18th and 19th century that was seen to be degrading or dehumanizing in some way. One very important movement in the formation of how we think about ourselves today is found in the late 18th, early 19th century. It's called Romanticism. And one very good Romantic poet to read in order to capture the essence of what Romanticism is doing would be William Wordsworth. Wordsworth sort of builds off that Rousseau idea that it's society that corrupts. And it's not his greatest poem, but it's a very illustrative poem in terms of his philosophy. The Idiot Boy. It's a poem based on the story of a little boy called Johnny. Johnny has what we would today call learning difficulties. And he lives in this village, and a neighbor falls ill. So Johnny's mother sends Johnny off on a horse to fetch the doctor from the neighboring town, and Johnny never comes back, so they have to send out a search party to find Johnny, and they find him sitting on the back of his horse in an opening in the woods, puzzling over why the sun is so cold and the cocks are crowing to wit to woo. Well, of course, Johnny has mistaken the moon for the sun, and he's mistaken the owls for cockerels. And what Wordsworth's trying to do in this poem is point out that what you have with Johnny is unvarnished humanity. We would say he has no filters, but you're getting humanity there really untouched by civilization. And there's a certain straightforwardness, there's a certain honesty, there's a certain lack of performance in the way Johnny relates to those around him. And that's part of Wordsworth's project of how do we overcome the problems of humanity in the 19th century by getting back behind society to nature. And so he holds up a character like Johnny with no filters as a good example of, this is somebody uncorrupted. When you look at somebody like Rousseau or think about how the Romantics looked at the world, it's very clear that in emphasizing the pristine, unspoiled, original self of nature, there's an anti-institutional dimension to their thinking. Institutions, the church, for example, these are sources of corruption. These are things that try to squeeze you into their mold. So Romanticism, Rousseau's thinking, definitely has an anti-institutional dimension to it. One question I'm often asked is, why spend all this time explaining why we have particular sins particularly plausible today? Isn't it just the case human beings, fallen human beings, will always sin in any context in which you place them? I would say, yes, that's true, but actually, in helping us to speak to and address those sins and the problems those sins cause, it's often helpful to understand the background, the backstory. When I teach history, I'll often begin by putting a statement on the board. The Twin Towers in Manhattan fell down on 9/11 because of gravity. And then I'll ask the students, is that a true or false statement? And the students will say, well, it's a true statement. And I'll say to them, and does it give me any useful information on 9/11? And they'll say, well, almost none. Because, of course, it's just talking about the general rule of gravity. And the 9/11 towers didn't just fall down because of the general rule of gravity. There's a whole complex history of foreign relations, religion, etc., that lies behind that incident. And knowing all of that stuff enables you to really understand what's going on. So when I come to modern society, I want to ask, what are the particular sins that we are prone to? And why are we prone to those particular sins? Because if I know what's shaping the imagination to tilt us towards this sin or that sin, then I can address that in my writings or my lectures or my sermons and make people aware of the forces that are perhaps shaping how they think, of which they themselves are not aware. Take my friend George here in the goldfish bowl, swimming around in the water, totally unaware of his environment. I could pour salt into this water and George would be helpless. He would die very, very quickly. If George had a human brain and understood that the water needed to be kept at a certain quality and a certain temperature, if he was self-conscious about the particularities of his environment, he'd stand a better chance of survival. Christians who are self-conscious about the particularities of the culture in which they live are better equipped to respond to the particular sins and particular challenges they face.
You need a little fee in your life. You need a little me in your life. I want to see the sea in your eyes. You need to be free.